My dear friends, this is the last set of the 12 sets of 9 WH questions. Like before, we need a sentence to frame these WH questions. So what we are going to do is, we are going to take a verb, and based upon that verb we are going to add an subject and an object. Okay, so the verb is write, W-R-I-T-E. Now we have a verb over here. We need a subject and an object. So let's take a subject as he. If we are taking he as a subject, then we need to add an S over here, and we need to write an object. Let's say stories. So here we have a sentence. He writes stories. Now based upon this sentence, we are going to frame these WH questions. Let's start with what. What does he do? Here it is. He writes stories. Second one. Where does he write stories? Answer to that. He writes stories indoors and outdoors. Third one. When does he write stories? He writes stories when he gets ideas. Fourth one. Why does he write stories? The answer to that. He writes stories to make a living. Fifth one. Who writes stories? Now let's give a name to this person. Prasad writes stories. Sixth one. Whose stories does he write? He writes children's stories. Seventh one. With whom does he write stories? He writes stories alone. Eighth one. Which stories does he write? Answer to that. He writes stories of fiction. Ninth one, how does he write stories? Answer to that, he writes stories interestingly. So there we have the final set. I'm going to read this set once again for you, and then we are going to convert it into 11 more sets. So what does he do? He writes stories. Where does he write stories? He writes stories indoors and outdoors. When does he write stories? He writes stories when he gets ideas. Why does he write stories? He writes stories to make a living. Who writes stories? Prasad writes stories. Whose stories does he write? He writes children's stories. With whom does he write stories? He writes stories alone. Which stories does he write? He writes stories of fiction. How does he write stories? He writes stories interestingly. We'll go to the next one. What did he do? He wrote stories. Where did he write stories? He wrote stories indoors and outdoors. When did he write stories? He wrote stories when he got ideas. Why did he write stories? He wrote stories to make a living. Who wrote stories? Prasad wrote stories. Whose stories did he write? He wrote children's stories. With whom did he write stories? He wrote stories alone. Which stories did he write? He wrote stories of fiction. How did he write stories? He wrote stories interestingly. Let's go to the third set. What will he do? He will write stories. Where will he write stories? He will write stories indoors and outdoors. When will he write stories? He will write stories when he will get ideas. Why will he write stories? He will write stories to make a living. Who will write stories? Prasad will write stories. Whose stories will he write? He will write children's stories. With whom will he write stories? He will write stories alone. Which stories will he write? He will write stories of fiction. How will he write stories? He will write stories interestingly. That takes us to the fourth one. What is he doing? He is writing stories. Where is he writing stories? He is writing stories indoors and outdoors. When is he writing stories? He is writing stories when he gets ideas. Then, why is he writing stories? He is writing stories to make a living. Who is writing stories? Prasad is writing stories. Whose stories is he writing? He is writing children's stories. With whom is he writing stories? He is writing stories alone. Which stories is he writing? He is writing stories of fiction. How is he writing stories? He is writing stories interestingly. Let's go to the sixth one. What was he doing? He was writing stories. Where was he writing stories? He was writing stories indoors and outdoors. When was he writing stories? He was writing stories when he was getting ideas. Why was he writing stories? He was writing stories to make a living. Who was writing stories? Prasad was writing stories. Whose stories was he writing? He was writing the children's stories. With whom was he writing stories? He was writing stories alone. Which stories was he writing? He was writing stories of fiction. How was he writing stories? He was writing stories interestingly. That takes us to the sixth one. What will he be doing? He will be writing stories. Where will he be writing stories? He will be writing stories indoors and outdoors. When will he be writing stories? He will be writing stories when he will be getting ideas. Why will he be writing stories? He will be writing stories to make a living. Who will be writing stories? Prasad will be writing stories. Whose stories will he be writing? He will be writing the children's stories. With whom will he be writing stories? He will be writing stories alone. Which stories will he be writing? He will be writing stories of fiction. How will he be writing stories? He will be writing stories interestingly. That takes us to the 7th one. What has he done? He has written stories. Where has he written stories? He has written stories both outdoors and indoors. When has he written stories? He has written stories when he had got ideas. Why had he written stories? He had written stories to make a living. Who had written stories? Prasad had written stories. Whose stories had he written? He had written the children's stories. With whom had he written stories? He had written stories alone. Okay. Which stories had he written? He had written stories of fiction. How had he written stories? He had written stories interestingly. That takes us to the 8th one. What had he done? He had written stories. Where had he written stories? He had written stories indoors and outdoors. When had he written stories? He had written stories when he had got ideas. Why had he written stories? He had written stories to make a living. Who had written stories? Prasad had written stories. Whose stories had he written? He had written the children's stories. Okay. With whom had he written stories? He had written stories alone. Which stories had he written? He had written the children's stories of fiction. How had he written stories? He had written stories interestingly. Let's go to the 9th one. What will he have done? He will have written stories. Where will he have written stories? He will have written stories indoors and outdoors. When will he have written stories? He will have written stories when he will have got ideas. Why will he have written stories? He will have written stories to make a living. Who will have written stories? Prasad will have written stories. Whose stories will he have written? He will have written children's stories. With whom will he have written stories? He will have written stories alone. Which stories will he have written? He will have written stories of fiction. How will he have written stories? He will have written stories interestingly. Now let's go to the 10th one. What has he been doing? He has been writing stories. Where has he been writing stories? He has been writing stories indoors and outdoors. When has he been writing stories? He has been writing stories when he has been getting ideas. Why has he been writing stories? He has been writing stories to make a living. Who has been writing stories? Prasad has been writing stories. Whose stories has he been writing? He has been writing children's stories. With whom has he been writing stories? He has been writing stories alone. Which stories has he been writing? He has been writing the stories of fiction. How has he been writing stories? He has been writing stories interestingly. Now that takes us to the 11th one. What had he been doing? He had been writing stories. Where had he been writing stories? He had been writing stories indoors and outdoors. When had he been writing stories? He had been writing stories when he had been getting ideas. Why had he been writing stories? He had been writing stories to make a living. Who had been writing stories? Prasad had been writing stories. Whose stories had he been writing? He had been writing children's stories. With whom had he been writing stories? He had been writing stories alone. Which stories had he been writing? He had been writing stories of fiction. How had he been writing stories? He had been writing stories interestingly. Let's go to the last and final one. What will he have been doing? He will have been writing stories. Where will he have been writing stories? He will have been writing stories indoors and outdoors. When will he have been writing stories? He will have been writing stories when he will have been getting ideas. Why will he have been writing stories? He will have been writing stories to make a living. Who will have been writing stories? Prasad will have been writing stories. Whose stories will he have been writing? He will have been writing children's stories. With whom will he have been writing stories? He will have been writing stories alone. Which stories will he have been writing? He will have been writing stories of fiction. How will he have been writing stories? He will have been writing stories interestingly. Friends, I have given you many videos to practice on this subject, 12 sets of 9 WH questions. Each contains 9 questions and 9 answers. How much is that? 18 sentences. Now 18 into 12 sets. 12 8s are 96, 12 1s 12 plus 9, 21. So every time you click a video, you are going to practice 216 sentences, isn't it? So what happens when you practice 216 sentences? Even if you want to commit something wrong, you will not commit wrong. The exact thing will come out of your mouth because you have practiced so many sentences. Your vocal cords has got adjusted to those sounds and the words are coming freely from your mouth. So you have gained a lot of confidence to ask these WH questions, and if someone asks WH questions, you have confidence in answering them to the point. That is building confidence, and that is how you are improving your fluency in English. You have been improving on your vocabulary, you have been improving on your pronunciation, and you have also been improving on the neutral accent which I speak. Friends, I have many more videos. All you need to do is just click on those videos and you will be able to get more lessons on these. I wish you all the best. Happy viewing.